Welcome everyone to theScore Fantasy Football Podcast presented by Subway. I'm your host, Justin Boone, the lead fantasy analyst at theScore, and I am joined by my co-host, David P. Woods, a man who has just been breaking down as the season's gone along here. Woods, you missed a bunch of work in the last week. You've been dealing with a cough pretty much all season long. I will say, though, you gutted it out for the Sunday episode. Didn't sound the best, but you at least gutted it out for that one. I think at this point, man, maybe forget about your fantasy teams making it to the championship. Is your body even going to make it to the fantasy championship?
I'm going to make it. I'm on the upswing. You know,
Okay.
I haven't missed an episode yet. How are you not breaking down? The NFL season is like such a grind. There's just so much to do all week long. I don't know how you're holding up, but I got like 3 kinds of medication going through my bloodstream right now. I'm feeling great, so we're ready to go here.
Well, people who can see the video version of the podcast can probably see the dark bags under my eyes. They've been there for a while now, and you know, I was able to shave today. I had a pretty big beard going for the last month or so, but I shaved today. So we're keeping up here. We got, 3 weeks left to go here in the fantasy season. We're into the fantasy playoffs. It's an exciting time, too, right? We've got a bunch of teams in the fantasy playoffs. We're both going for titles in a couple spots.
Yeah, I mean, I can't wait. In our main league that we play against each other, you got a bye this week, which must be nice. I'm going to have to grind it out, but I'll see you next week, I think. Yeah.
Good stuff. All right, on today's episode, we're going to discuss a couple players that we think are announcing their arrivals as potential fantasy stars. Then we're going to preview Week 14 with our guest, Josh ADHD of Fantasy Insiders, and talk about the biggest questions heading into the fantasy playoffs, which this week just seems to revolve around running backs, right? We got Jaylen Samuels and Jeff Wilson Jr. both stepping into starting roles. We have Spencer Ware, Austin Ekeler, Justin Jackson. They're all in their second game here, taking over sort of bigger roles after starters went down. Got the Eagles backs facing some tough matchups in the fantasy playoffs. The Ravens backs probably going to have to be playing from behind. That could change their approach this week. And Green Bay, right? What are they going to look like post Mike McCarthy here? So lots to discuss, obviously. And then, as always, we're going to wrap it up with players that are being overlooked in Week 14. But before we get to all that, make sure you're subscribing to the podcast on iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, Spotify, Anchor, whatever podcast platform you're using. And once you are, do us a favor, drop a rating and a review on there. All right, Woods, let's take a look at a couple players who have burst onto the scene in our Fantasy Arrivals segment, which is presented by our friends at Subway, home of the new Montreal Steak Spice Collection. I'm going with Courtland Sutton this week, and he isn't someone that's coming out of nowhere. He's slowly been, building consistency and been producing as the season's gone along, has 50 yards or a touchdown in 8 of his last 9 games, coming off his best game of the season, a 4-catch, 85-yard, 1-touchdown outing, and his schedule is just excellent over the next few weeks, including the 49ers on Sunday. They're giving up the 5th most fantasy points to the wide receiver position. So Sutton, a very solid wide receiver 3 with wide receiver 2 upside once again.
All right, I'm going to go with Josh Allen. I can't believe I'm saying it, but Josh Allen might actually be worth starting this week. He's the top scoring fantasy quarterback over the last 2 weeks, largely because he had 99 yards rushing and then 135 yards rushing in those contests. That's just ridiculous. I mean, that's more yards than Lamar Jackson over the same span. Bills have the Jets this week. I mean, that's not a scary opponent at all. If you're in a situation where if you're in the fantasy playoffs and you need a quarterback streamer, I would look to Josh Allen.
That is just wild. Never would have thought at this point in the season that we'd be saying that, but that's where we are. Let's bring on today's guest. He's an innovative mind in the fantasy industry, always seems to be working on new ways to present data to fantasy players. It's Josh ADHD of Fantasy Insiders and RotoGrinders. You can find him on Twitter at FantasyADHD. I highly recommend following him. Josh, we really appreciate you coming on.
Fellas, thanks for having me. It's fun to talk some football with y'all.
And I know I've complimented you before for it, but I'm going to do it again here. The draft tool that you have for the Scott Fishbowl, it's one of the coolest creations you have. Why don't you give the listeners a bit of a rundown of what you're working on in season?
Yeah, so in season, I developed an app this year now that RotoGrinders and Fantasy Insiders have access to the advanced metric data that SIS, Sports Info Solutions, provides. So we have access to that data feed, and what this data feed provides is a lot more boutique data. So this is film watcher data where they would track, like who pressures the quarterback, what type of pressure was it, what type of routes is everyone on the field running, how many wide receivers, how many defensive backs. and so on and so forth. So we have this very boutique data, and what it allows me to do is create some more nuanced tools instead of just looking at, typical statistics like targets and air yards and whatnot. So we have that data, but we can also split it by, where the receiver was lined up in the formation. Was he in the slot? Was he out wide? Was he in the backfield? And we could do the same on the defensive side from a, like a pressure standpoint. We can look at, offenses and defenses and what type of pressure they get or allow on the quarterback. So this provides a little more insight into maybe some decision making that we can use going forward. So we have a tool on Fantasy Insiders called the Premium Usage app. It has all of this good stuff in it. It's still growing. We're still adding, widgets here and there as the season goes along. And then once we get to the off season, it's going to probably undergo another massive expansion. So that's been my main thrust this season, is getting that up and online. And then also just administering the current apps that I have. We have an Air Yards app that is also on Fantasy Insiders that provides visualizations of passing games from an offensive and defensive standpoint, and something I use every single week to get a better handle on how an offense might attack a defense.
It's awesome stuff, and it's never more important than this time of the season, the fantasy playoffs. It seems like this week there's, even more moving pieces than usual, and it should make for some interesting playoff matchups. Could create some controversy too, right? Jaylen Samuels takes over for James Conner, and we know how productive the Steelers' starting running back has been in the past, regardless of who's lined up there, really, right? Samuels sort of, just been a fairly average backup this season, but he also has tight end eligibility. I know on Yahoo at least, it's one of the biggest fantasy host sites, and really going to tilt things in owners' favor if you can put him into that spot. I think he can produce RB2 numbers this week, and that makes him a top 3, top 4 tight end, maybe even the most valuable tight end if you're slotting him in there. It doesn't exactly seem fair, but I get the stance from Yahoo. He's been there all season. Tough to change it now at this point. He's a 5th-round pick, though, and he only has 19 touches this year. Mike Tomlin suggested that it's going to be more of a running back by committee. It's not really what we've seen from them in the past, but it could happen. And, Samuels has really started to come on as the backup over the last few weeks, really supplanted Stephen Ridley in that role. So there's a lot to unpack here, Josh, but I guess it really starts with, how confident are you in Jaylen Samuels this week?
Well, I'm not as confident as the crowd. And while I'm hopeful that he kind of has a bust out game here, I don't think he's going to be the lead back. I do think he's going to see some work in the passing game, but I think he's going to see a lot of carry work to Stephen Ridley, especially as they get near the goal line. Now, did they use Jaylen Samuels near the goal line last week? They certainly did. He caught a touchdown. He looked really good doing it. So I think he's going to play. I think he's probably going to end up playing maybe half the snaps. And I think he's going to end up splitting touches pretty heavily with Stephen Ridley. Stephen Ridley's not a bad running back. He just hasn't been, present in the scene for, 3 years now, maybe. But, when he was in New England, outside the fumbling issues, he was fine. Like he was very productive. And I think he can be very productive in Pittsburgh. They have a pretty decent blocking offensive line. Obviously, the passing game is what it is. So I think Ridley can provide a lot of value as a pivot to Jaylen Samuels.
I'm on the same boat. I think we need to slow the Jaylen Samuels hype train a little bit here. I know, Boone, you have him in your lineup right now, and it's crazy. We have 2 running backs and a flex and a tight end, which is a pretty standard fantasy lineup. And you look at it, it's like there's 4 running backs in a row right there. That's crazy. It seems like such an advantage. But I don't think Jaylen Samuels is going to be anything close to an approximation of James Conner. This is a player who had double-digit rushing attempts just once in his college career. I mean, he's not a workhorse. Sort of, as you can tell by his classification on a site like Yahoo, what running back, tight end, like we didn't really know what he was going to be when he entered the NFL. He's sort of just a receiving weapon, can carry the ball out of the backfield, but is sort of better catching passes. And I think Stephen Ridley is definitely going to factor in. If you go look at what the Steelers beat writers are saying, they're sort of suggesting that Ridley's going to handle early down work and Samuel's going to sort of work as a third down back. And that isn't necessarily going to equate to huge fantasy value. It may be Ridley who gets the goal line work and scores a touchdown or 2 here and comes out of this game looking like the far more valuable Steelers running back. So, I mean, unless you have like Travis Kelce on your roster, I think you're probably pretty interested in putting Jaylen Samuels in as a tight end if you can, but I would be a lot less excited about putting him in as a running back. But again, you may be at the point of the season where he's still your best option there.
Yeah, especially for Connor owners. I mean, I think we can all agree that the Raiders have just been hammered by running backs this year, right? The fourth most fantasy points allowed to running backs, 159 yards from scrimmage and 2 TDs to Marlon Mack, 86 and a touchdown to Raheem Mostert, 165 and a touchdown to Melvin Gordon, 154 to David Johnson, 118 to Gus Edwards. The worst performance against them recently was last week with Spencer Ware, and he still went over 50 yards and had a touchdown, so it was an okay fantasy day for him. Samuels is a solid receiver. I agree that he's for sure going to get more work in the passing game and that Ridley will still be involved, and the big risk is that he's going to vulture at the goal line. I think that's my biggest concern. I just think the Steelers throw quite a bit, and I think they're going to work him into the game plan that way.
One last thing I'll say is consider Steelers going to the West Coast, playing in that time zone where they're always worse. So, I mean, maybe you temper your expectations a little bit more there. But again, yeah, it's the Raiders. Like, how are you not going to start a Steelers running back against the Raiders, I guess?
And Samuels wasn't the only potential starter available on the waiver wire this week. A lot of owners went out and got Jeff Wilson Jr., the 49ers. Woods, I know that you are one of them because I saw in our league that you grabbed him. He got a surprising workload last week after Breda aggravated his ankle injury in warmups. Wilson saw 15 carries for 61 yards, caught 8 passes for 73 yards, really out of nowhere. Nobody saw it coming. He also lost a fumble that game, which is at least worth noting. But the team was very quick to rule out Breda this week, which was surprising based on the fact that he just seemed to keep playing every single week through all these injuries. So you know it must be serious at this point if they're shutting him down that quickly in the week. But often once you miss one game, it's a little easier to miss 2 or 3, or if you're playing on a team that's not going to the playoffs, maybe just sitting out the rest of the season. That's possible there. And like Samuels, Wilson Jr. has a chance to be sort of a surprise star down the stretch. It seems like every year we get 1 or 2 backs that sort of pop up on everyone's radar and carry some teams to titles potentially. Both those guys have a chance to do it. With this week, we're just going to start with this week, Josh. How much of Breda's, regular production do you think fantasy owners are going to get from Wilson, who's at home against Denver on Sunday?
I don't see why you wouldn't expect to get close to 100%, because to me, while Breda he's proved to be relatively durable in that he can, he resists injury pretty well. He can soldier through. I think the running back for Kyle Shanahan it's a product of the offense, the scheme, and I think this is going to be really a kind of a rubber meets the road week for San Francisco running back as they plug in Jeff Wilson here. I think he's going to be productive. The Denver rush defense, it's okay, it's not great. Joe Mixon was reasonably productive against them last week in a negative game script. And I think this week, even though they will probably be in a bit of a negative game script, I don't think it's going to be negative enough that's going to shut him out. So I expect him to be pretty productive this week. I don't have any issue starting him.
I think I'm in lockstep with Josh again here. I mean, I wouldn't even fear a very negative game script, I don't think, because, Wilson caught 8 of 9 passes they threw to him last week, so he can stay involved even if they're trailing in the game. And I think you can basically slot him in. Like, we're not necessarily comparing him to Matt Breda. We're comparing him to an injured Matt Breda who's been playing quite injured all season. And I think, you can probably expect pretty similar numbers to what Breda would have put up.
Yeah, I have him in the RB2 range, sort of the low-end RB2 range. Broncos' run D's been playing better recently. Earlier in the season, they gave up a couple 200-yard games. Definitely haven't done anything like that recently, but they're giving up a lot of receiving work to backs, and I think we're going to see Wilson get a bunch of work in that area. And, Samuels and Wilson have really been all the talk this week. Last week, it was Spencer Ware who was the surprise starter in a great matchup with the Raiders. Didn't really put up the kind of day I think we all expected, but like I said earlier, saved his performance with the touchdown. Now the matchup gets a lot more difficult against the Ravens. Sharkandrick West was signed. He knows the system, could possibly get involved in the passing game there. Damian Williams is there as well. He looked decent last week. Josh, what's your outlook for Ware this week in the harder matchup?
I think it's probably going to be pretty similar to last week. I'm not too hopeful with this matchup. Baltimore's just a tough defense. We have to make no bones about it. They're tough. They shut down the Falcons at home last week. And while I think Kansas City's going to put points on the board, I still think it's going to be tough sledding on the running game. And in my opinion, it's going to be a split backfield, like you mentioned. I mean, they signed Charkandrick West. You mentioned that already. I think this work is going to be divvied up, and it's going to be tough to slate Ware in for any kind of, high production if we know that he's going to get only half the work.
I'm kind of surprised at how quickly this situation has become muddy, because when Kareem Hunt was suddenly out of the picture, I think it was the easy answer was to say, Spencer Ware is just going to pick up where Kareem Hunt left off and do, 90% of what Kareem Hunt was doing. But I thought Spencer Ware looked pretty bad last week. He sort of ran sluggishly. He didn't look at all like the player who had a pretty big season a few years ago. And Damian Williams looked quite a bit better. So I wanted to then be excited and say, maybe Damian Williams, the more explosive player, is the one you want here. And then they go out and sign Charkandrick West, who I think has some overlap in what he can do with Williams. So I'm not excited about any of them. I think they're going to give Ware the chance again to sort of be the guy. Based on what we saw last week, in my snap judgment of him, I'm just not very excited about him athletically.
I totally agree. I think, having a full week to practice, knowing you're going to be the starter is going to help him a little bit, but the matchup is so hard. But Woods, like you sort of said about LeGarrette Blount a couple weeks ago on Thanksgiving, this is a guy in an offense where the Chiefs could put him at the goal line several times that we could see him score a couple touchdowns fairly easily in this game. So that's always there. It makes him pretty tough to drop further than that, low-end RB2 range. We also saw Austin Ekeler ticketed for big things last week with Melvin Gordon sidelined, and he didn't really come through either. Outsnapped Justin Jackson 49-14, but Ekeler only produced 43 yards on 18 touches. Meanwhile, Jackson went for 82 and a score on just 9 touches. This week, the Chargers get the Bengals, and they're giving up the most fantasy points to running backs. And as 14-point favorites, you have to think that the Chargers are going to be able to lean on the run quite a bit in this one. Josh, do you see Jackson getting more work, maybe eating into Eckler's touches in this game? Or do you think maybe there's a chance that both these guys put up decent fantasy numbers in such a good matchup?
I think it's definitely a situation where both of these guys can put numbers up this week. Jackson finally got to see, I'd say, more work in the second half last week. And I think it's probably going to be the same case again, not necessarily in the second half, but I think they'll work him in the way that they worked Ekeler in with Melvin Gordon. I mean, both of these guys are going to see passing volume. I think both players will see plenty of rushing volume. It's going to be, in my opinion, probably a 60-40, 65-35 split. And in that case, I think there's enough room for both of these guys to get plenty of production out of their volume. So I like both players this week. I actually targeted Justin Jackson in a few places in the event that he relegates Ekeler back to the Ekeler role and he kind of takes over as the, quote unquote, every down back for Los Angeles.
I, once again, fully agree. I thought Jackson looked so much better than Ekeler last week that we could see a 50-50 split this week. We could even see Jackson sort of leading there, and we're worried about Ekeler eating into Jackson's workload. And maybe the biggest story here is that for Melvin Gordon owners, I don't know why there's any reason for the Chargers to rush Melvin Gordon back on the field. They have 2 competent running backs and they have playoff aspirations. I think they'll play it nice and easy with Melvin Gordon, and we may not see him until you are already eliminated from the fantasy playoffs if you're a Gordon owner.
Yeah, I have a couple teams where I have Gordon, and sadly, I kind of agree with you there. The only reason to bring him back, maybe in that Week 15 game, if he's ready, is they still would have a chance to catch the Chiefs, right? They're only 1 game back there, so it is possible that they would still have a chance there against the Chiefs, but it would just be kind of foolish if you're looking at, the playoffs and maybe making a Super Bowl run. You'd want Gordon as healthy as possible for sure. So if those guys are playing well, you probably keep them on the sidelines, unfortunately, for fantasy owners. Let's keep rolling through running backs here. There was some concern last week over Josh Adams' health. It came up on Sunday, but he suited up for another game, had a second straight game with at least 20 touches and at least 84 rushing yards. Unfortunately, things are going to get a whole lot more difficult for him. The Eagles face the Cowboys, the Rams, and the Texans over the next 3 weeks. Those are all teams that either have solid run defenses or, who have a good chance to get out in front and really maybe prevent the Eagles from giving Adams a ton of touches. Josh, can fantasy owners still be excited about Adams here despite that really tough schedule during the fantasy playoffs?
I think so, especially owners that are, that are suffering through some injuries right now or, had to deal with Kareem Hunt. I think Adams is a perfect guy to slot in, to get 80% of that volume back. He's getting, just a little bit of pass work. It's not a lot. Darren Sproles is back, so I think he kind of slots in now as the the quote unquote the receiving back there, and he's going to get some carries himself. I think really for a production standpoint, Sproles is the biggest threat to Adams. And it's not Corey Clement, and it's definitely not Wendell Smallwood. But I think the two of those players are different enough. They're thunder and lightning that Adams is going to get plenty of work. Even in negative game script, I still think they are going to run the ball a decent amount. And even if they're not running the ball, I think you'll see an uptick in targets, and that's a good thing, especially in PPR leagues. So I'm not hesitant about playing Josh Adams at all. I think he's a good player, and even in tough matchups, you cannot really fade a running back that's getting his work.
And you brought up a good point that there's so many running backs that are out the last couple weeks, right? When you're talking about Gordon and Hunt and Breda and all these guys, and Connor, obviously, there's so many guys that are out. You might not have another option, but I do have Adams a little bit lower here at RB29 at the moment, and it is because Sproles is working in, and Clement's actually looked a little bit better the last couple weeks, kind of struggled when he had the chance to take on that starting role. But that might have been health related. He was dealing with some injuries at that point. Maybe he's finally healthy now. They've kind of worked him in a little bit more the last couple of weeks. And the biggest thing for me is just the Eagles offense isn't producing like we thought it was going to at the beginning of the season. So not as many scoring opportunities. That makes their running back a little less desirable.
Yeah, I'm worried about Sproles. If you look at the Eagles' tendencies, looking back to week 1 and last season, they just like to give Sproles work in the red zone. He doesn't profile at all as like a goal line back, you wouldn't think, but they just sort of give him that kind of work, and he's pretty good at it despite how small he is. So, I mean, yeah, you're probably not benching Adams if you're at this point and he's got you here, but I wouldn't feel very confident in him with Sproles back, and that's just sort of the story of a lot of these running backs here. The shine is just sort of coming off some of these guys. But, I mean, it's crunch time. You can't really feel great about a lot of these guys. You just got to sort of, close your eyes, click them into your starting lineup, and hope for the best.
The Ravens' backfield also in a bit of a tough spot this week. The Chiefs aren't great at defending the run, but they present a different game script than what the Ravens have been facing the last few weeks. They've been winning. They've been favored. Gus Edwards' stat lines over that time, 17 for 115, 23 for 118, 21 for 82 last week. All wins against inferior opponents. Now they're touchdown underdogs to the Chiefs here, and since Edwards doesn't catch a lot of passes, he really could get game scripted out of this one. He also limped off the field late in last week's game. Could have possibly re-aggravated. He's been dealing with that ankle injury. He says that he's fine. He says he's going to play. We know players can sometimes be, optimistic about their outlook. So that's one to watch, and definitely a reason to make sure that you have Kenneth Dixon on your team, Ty Montgomery even. Have those guys stashed as backups there, because they could step into a role here if Edwards, for some reason, ends up being out. Josh, how are you approaching the Ravens' backfield in this game, in a game where they could be trailing quite a bit?
Yeah, I'm not too afraid of Gus Edwards. And, you did mention his lack of target volume. I don't know if that's really anything other than game script itself. I mean, they've been ahead. They've been in these positive game scripts where they don't necessarily need to throw the ball to the running back. They can just run. If they get behind in this game, I still think it's possible they could give Edwards a few targets. And, if he gets 3 targets, that's good. I think that's healthy volume without going overboard from a projection standpoint. I still think Baltimore's going to be able to put points on the board. They're not going to get shut out. And at the root of everything is that they are a running team now. Pure running team. So with that, I still think Edwards is going to see in the neighborhood of 15 to 18 touches. It's really hard to fade that. I mean, that volume's just not growing on trees right now. So I think if you have Edwards and you really are strapped for options, I think you still play him with confidence that he can get in the end zone, even if he only gets, say, 75 or 80 yards.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think the Ravens are in much position to get away from the run here. They're not going to be able to match the Chiefs in a passing shootout, so they're just going to have to trust that defense can somewhat limit the Chiefs' scoring. And, I mean, we know the Chiefs are going to put up points, and the Ravens are going to have to run the ball with Jackson and Edwards. And, again, I think you can just trust that the volume will still be there enough to make him a worthwhile start.
A little bit of breaking news here on the podcast. We're recording on Wednesday. Emmanuel Sanders was helped off the field at practice, wasn't able to put any weight on his leg. We don't know the situation. We don't know the diagnosis. Hopefully it doesn't turn out to be anything serious, but another reason to like Courtland Sutton this week. Before we wrap up, we have to get your thoughts here, Josh, on the Mike McCarthy firing. should we expect anything different from this Packers offense post McCarthy? I mean, especially since they're going up against a pretty soft Falcons defense here, or do you think it's just going to be more of the same over the last month?
I think we can expect an uptick. I think we're going to see a bit of a dead cat bounce out of this offense. And from everything I'm reading right now, it looks like Joe Philbin is not going to call plays. He's just going to design the scheme of the offense. And what it appears right now is that Aaron Rodgers is going to be running the show on the field, basically calling his own plays and running the offense the way he wants to run it. I think everybody has the feeling that was the main source of friction, if there was any friction between he and Mike McCarthy, was the fact that McCarthy seemed to do what Rodgers didn't want to do in so many cases. And if Rodgers is calling the offense, I'm interested. I'd like to see what he does. I do think we see a lot more Aaron Jones in this case. Rodgers is on record as liking Aaron Jones the best of the running back group they have there. And it'll be interesting to see what they do from, maybe a route standpoint. If they try to do anything different the way they run their routes, the narrative is that they run nothing but crossing routes, shallow routes. And if maybe that changes a little bit this week, because surely they've got something in their playbook where their receivers get vertical downfield a little bit more than what they have been. So I'm interested, especially this week. It's kind of a get-right week for Green Bay, in my opinion. And I would not be at all surprised if Aaron Rodgers finished at QB1.
Yeah, I kind of agree. I've had Rodgers a little lower in the last few weeks just because he's been more of a low-end QB1 this season. But I just have this sneaking suspicion that he's the kind of guy that's going to want to go out this week and really show well after McCarthy's gone.
Yeah, that's what I wrote down here. I mean, he's so everyone in the NFL is competitive, but Aaron Rodgers is competitive on a different level, and I think you might say he's vindictive. I think he really wants to make Mike McCarthy look bad. I don't have a ton of faith that Aaron Rodgers is like the next great offensive coordinator, but I think he can run an offense just as well or better than Mike McCarthy did. And I'm very curious to see sort of an Aaron Rodgers, truly Aaron Rodgers directed offense. And yeah, I mean, he's playing sort of for personal pride here to show that I wasn't the reason that this team struggled this season. And also, I mean, maybe he, in a little way, is auditioning for a next head coach. I mean, he wants to bring in the absolute best head coach possible, I would imagine, so he can sort of show off and say, hey, come work with me next season. This is what you're working with. So I think we could see a real Aaron Rodgers-y final few weeks here as he just goes nuts.
And I can't stress that matchup enough, right, against the Falcons. I really think everyone on that offense could have a good week this week. So the final question, Josh, we do this every single week. A lot of players get overlooked. No matter how we rank, no matter how accurate we could possibly be, there are still going to be players that people miss on and that we miss on in our rankings. So which players do you think are being overlooked in week 14?
I looked at wide receiver because I feel like this is where we always seem to find the best gold every week. And one player in particular I thought was interesting was Michael Gallup. He's really cheap on the daily fantasy sites this week, and he's probably available on your waiver wire right now. We're talking about a wide receiver that has seen an uptick in usage over the last 4 weeks. He's getting a healthy target volume now. It's anywhere between 4 to 7 targets in a game. I think this game with Philadelphia this week will be competitive. But I think both teams will put, a decent amount of points on the board, let's say in the low to mid 20s. And if that's the case, I think Gallup has an opportunity here to really, really outkick his coverage from a production standpoint. So if we think he's going to get, 5 to 7 targets, I think he can get in the end zone here. I think he can get 80 to 100 yards playing opposite of Amari Cooper against, Philadelphia secondary that's really beat up still. So I really like him. If Emmanuel Sanders is out this week, I think Cortland Sutton is more or less – he's going to see Richard Sherman, but that doesn't deter me all that much if he sees Richard Sherman. So I really like Cortland Sutton. I know you mentioned him at the beginning of the pod as a player that's coming on strong. I really like him. I think he's maybe a bit overlooked right now. And then otherwise at wide receiver, I'm not seeing too much. I mean, we may talk about Dante Pettis after his explosion last week. I think that's a bit more smoke and mirrors. Maybe one player we might talk about overlooked is Kiki QT if he is healthy. If he's healthy and ready to go against Indianapolis, I think he's in a really good spot and could, again, really outkick his coverage from a production standpoint.
Good stuff. I mean, I'm going to cross Gallup off my list here because I also had him written down. On the Sutton note, we have another update on Emmanuel Sanders. Team fears a torn ACL there. Hopefully that's not the case, but normally when that's the early diagnosis, Woods, that's normally what it ends up being, as you brought up before. It's an easier one to diagnose there. Woods, who do you got this week for overlooked?
I wouldn't overlook Bears receiving options. That's a few guys. That's like Allen Robinson, Trey Burton, maybe Anthony Miller if you're desperate, because Mitchell Trubisky is supposed to play again this week, so that elevates everyone there. Some of these are other receivers that we've talked about in recent weeks. I like them again this week. Chris Godwin and Adam Humphries with the Buccaneers. I think I like Bruce Ellington if you're looking for a receiver play in PPR leagues. I like Curtis Samuel this week to match up with Cam Newton, who is sort of trending in the wrong direction with some shoulder soreness, but Samuel's really coming on strong, so I like him this week. And then I'll just recap some guys we talked about before, which is just sort of backups to current backup running backs who have found themselves in starting situations. So that's guys like Stephen Ridley. He could easily have a bigger game than Jaylen Samuels. Justin Jackson could easily have a bigger game than Austin Ekeler. And it wouldn't blow me away if Damian Williams or even Charkandrick West had a bigger game than Spencer Ware this week. So don't overlook those guys. And I think they're even flex options if you're pretty desperate.
I think I said ACL for Sanders. It's actually Achilles that they're fearing. Achilles there. For me, don't forget about the Bears receivers this week. Allen Robinson, obviously the number one guy, but yeah, Miller, Gabriel, both those guys, they're going up against the Rams. They might have to put up some points, and if Trubisky's back this week, that could help that entire offense. Traquan Smith gets the Bucs defense. You know, he's been working through the injury, didn't have a really big game, hasn't really done much in a couple weeks here. But even on the road, I still think that matchup's good enough that you could consider him. Antonio Callaway as well. I'm talking about guys that you might not, normally look at because they don't necessarily have huge volume, but they're guys that can make a really big impact. It doesn't take much, only a couple big catches. Callaway gets that really burnable Panthers defense there, and he's been making some strides recently. We've talked about him a couple times on the podcast, and that Cleveland offense definitely improving. And I also had Gallup on there, but we nailed that right off the top there. Josh had that one. That does it for us today. Make sure you are following Josh on Twitter at FantasyADHD, keeping up with all his content at Fantasy Insiders and RotoGrinders. Josh, thanks for hanging out with us, man.
Appreciate you guys having me. That was a lot of fun.
Woods and I are going to be back on Sunday night breaking down all the action from Week 14. We're going to give you a first look at the waiver wire players you should be targeting next week heading into the fantasy semifinals. If you want to get in touch with Woods, he's at David P. Woods on Twitter. To see all of our fantasy content, you should be logging onto theScore every single day and following me on Twitter at Justin Boone. Big thanks to Josh. Big thanks to everybody out there for listening, and we will see you next time.
Said leave on time, my baby said leave on time.